really quickly when we get going, or at least quick for me. You know me well enough.
Okay. Don't do anything for 2 minutes.
Got it. Promise. Okay, let's go. No, just kidding.
So I missed it. Is this gonna be on Facebook Live?
Yeah, that's yeah, we are live, in fact, on Facebook right now. So yeah, exactly, Allison. It's very cool. I mean, it's Wednesday, which is, I don't know about you all, but that's my usual day to drink a vertical of Colgin. That, you know, it's what I do on Wednesday. I don't know about you people, but you know, get with it. Okay. What we're going to do is I'm quite excited about this one because I get to see Paul Roberts, with whom I have been friends for a long time, obviously fellow master sommeliers, and I get to hang out for the first time with Allison Tauziet to talk about, you know, uh, Colgin, great Cabernet blends from Napa. I think that'll probably do for now. But before I do that, I would just want to say that I hope you folks who are on have an opportunity to taste these wines, or have before, or are now, if you don't mind. And Allison, it's, you know, Tauziet, it's great to meet you via Zoom. I know that in happier days we can actually do this across a table in the real world. And so I hope everybody will take advantage of the fact that things are getting better, obviously very slowly, but it is nonetheless that, you know, we're going to see improvement over the next 12 months, and we actually can start knocking on doors at wineries and enjoying wines in restaurants again as we go along. So again, welcome to everybody to our benchmark live tasting of Colgin Cellars, and welcome everybody. And I think I will turn it over to Paul here in a second. But first, I do want to say, I'm sure Paul remembers the first time I met him. He was the sommelier at Cafe Annie. And Cafe Annie, for people who don't know about it, was not just one of the great restaurants of Texas. It was just one of the great restaurants. And Robert Del Grande just was one of the great personalities of the restaurant business. And Paul, I was there the first time, if I'm not mistaken, Paul, with Steve Olson, and he and I started peppering you with questions, not meaning to be the jerks, you know, that show up and start peppering the sommelier with questions, but because it was obvious from the get-go that you were a fellow, you know, spirit in this, and the conversation immediately burst, you know, full force. And you know, so I got to hang around you and be around you then, and in subsequent visits to Cafe Annie. And then I don't know that I've ever told you this story, and please forgive me for embarrassing you in advance, but I was on your tasting panel when you passed the Master Sommelier. And all I can say is, when you left the room, I made some comment, because, you know, you've done this enough times now to know levity is needed in that tense situation. You walked out of the room and I said, well, that was pretty close, right, guys? And the other two judges are like, because I don't know if you recall this, you named a brand, you asshole. Okay, you literally.
I remember the wine too.
Yes, you didn't just name the wine, you named the brand, and it was like, really? God. So anyway, that's who we're talking to, people. That's who you're talking to right now with Paul Roberts. So Paul, I'll shut up, or at least attempt to do so. It's not my strong suit, as you know, but yeah, can we talk about how you see and foresee what we're about to do?
Well, perfect. Well, first and foremost, Doug, thank you to you. Thank you to the entire team of Benchmark. And to my partner here, Allison Tauziet, cheers. We're glad to be having wine with all of you on a slightly sunny, slightly cloudy day here in Napa Valley, and tell the story of Colgin. I do remember that first time that you and Steve came into Cafe Annie, because I remember our conversation eventually devolved into a barbecue battle. First, we talked about food and we got on mole, and then it was, I thought we were going to come to fisticuffs over Kansas City versus Texas barbecue.
They're different.
They're different. And we finally agreed that we're different, but we also agreed that in so much of our conversations, that great wine is really what drives so much of our food love and conversation. It was actually when I was at Cafe Annie that I first got to meet Ann Colgin, and became friends from there. So I know for some of you, I think there's a number of you joining us, and we appreciate that in terms of the interactive live experience on Facebook and on Zoom. What we were going to start with was actually a little bit of a history lesson, because I think it becomes really important is that where many people may have heard of Colgin, they may not know the entirety of the history. And we're not going to go into every chapter and verse, but I think it becomes very important to understand what we have been working on for 3 decades and what we continue to work on today, through getting to work with the remarkable people that we do and these remarkable sites. So kind of the history of Colgin begins with Ann Colgin. She was, born and raised in the state of Texas, like myself, originally from Waco, eventually moved to Dallas, from Dallas to New York, got a degree in art history. Eventually life took her to London, and it was her time at London. She was working for an auction house and really studying arts and antiquities, and working for first Christie's and then Sotheby's. And eventually she's told us this story a number of times, that she would spend her days down in the crypts of Christie's looking at old arts and antiques, and the wine guys would come in bleary-eyed, and she said they looked like they're having much more fun than I was. And they would tell her about verticals of Petrus and different vintages of Lafitte. And she said, these guys are living a really remarkable life. And it was there that she began her tutelage and understanding of wine, which eventually led to becoming the head of the Sotheby's West Coast Wine Department in Los Angeles in the late 80s and the early 90s. And then it was during that period that she was spending summers and vacations and holidays in Napa Valley. And if you think back to what was happening in Napa Valley in that period, Napa Valley was beginning to almost be the phoenix rising from the ashes. Because what many people don't realize is that they think that Napa just has kind of like this new appellation which came out of nowhere. But there's historical basis for Napa being a world-class wine growing region going all the way back to post the US Civil War. We actually have the great fortune to work with a vineyard site called Tixon Hill. We're not tasting it today, but it's another one of our wines. But the first evidence of the planting of that vineyard was right around 1860. And Napa was getting international acclaim. Then, unfortunately, right around 1900, it had phylloxera and they had to start over. And then Napa Valley all of a sudden had, in the late 60s, early 70s, the emergence of some greatness. And new brands were coming on, new vineyards were being planted. But then, unfortunately, the vagaries of Mother Nature is that phylloxera came again. So much of the new planting, which was beginning to kind of re-allow Napa Valley to ascend to the throne of the great wine growing region, they were unfortunately destroyed again. So when you think between basically 1988 through the early part of the 90s, almost 65–70% of vineyards in Napa Valley had to be replanted because of phylloxera. Well, the typical kind of American and California spirit, instead of looking at this as devastation, people looked at it as opportunity. And many people said, well, wait, let's step back for a moment and think that we know Napa Valley can produce exquisite wine because it's been doing it for almost 100 years. But let's not just do the same thing that we've always done. Let's look for better rootstocks, better clonal selections. And for a few individuals, they said, well, they really believe that the magic was going to be in the hills. Much like how you study great European viticulture, and that for so many thousands of years, people were planting on the flatland, and then eventually, whether it be in the Mosel, in the Piedmont, in Burgundy, so many of the great wines were mid-slope hillside. And that became a very important ideal for a group of individuals, one of which was Ann Colgin. And after all of her studying and understanding of wine, she says, the hills are going to allow me to produce a wine which still has concentration, but can also have freshness. It's going to naturally kind of devigorate the vines and give it focus. And hopefully it is because of that struggle on these hillsides that we're going to get a wine that not just tastes of fruit, but also tastes of a place. And we'll talk about it a little bit more because those hillsides are also the flip side of a coin of how you have to look at European viticulture versus US viticulture. It becomes very important for us in terms of the stylistic approach that we have in terms of planting vineyards and ultimately the wine that we produce. So after a few years of looking, Anne was able to discover a vineyard. She didn't own it. It was a bootstrap operation. And it was a vineyard site called Herb Lamb. And it's right on the kind of toe of where Howe Mountain is, right behind the Meadowwood Golf Course. And that became the foundation for what was Colgin. So the very first vintage, 1992, there was just under 200 cases of wine produced, but immediately it was a wine that attracted attention. There was also a handful of other properties at that same time, which were having some similar ideals, but following their own footpath. And within that, we were all kind of grouped together. And we were grouped together under this term that I think first the Wine Spectator used and then Robert Parker used, and it was called the cult cabernet. And I beg of all of you, please stop using the word. Because almost the definition of cult, when you read it, is you're hot and then you're not. Well, we're into our third decade and we think that we're producing some of the best wine we've ever produced, and our team is dedicated to continuing operating that level. It's easy to remember, and many of these peers have grown up with us, and we continue to make great wine with our own view. So for a few years, that was the only wine that we produced at Colgin, was just a few hundred cases of Herb Lamb. But then Anne began to have the quest to find some other hillside vineyards. And over the course of basically from about the mid to late 90s, we were able to find 3 other vineyard sites, which would then begin to form the cohesive unit of what became known as Colgin. So when we now think of Colgin today, from where we started in 1992 to where we are today, we now make 3 single vineyard Cabernet Sauvignon wines and a single vineyard Syrah. Today, we're going to be focusing in on kind of the home turf, we call it, the vineyard site called Number 9 Estate, which is also where the winery is located. And within this site, it was a 125-acre parcel that had never been planted before on kind of the more closer to Oakville side of Pritchard Hill, at an elevation of about 1,100 to 1,400 feet. But it was on an aspect that many people thought you could never produce great wines. Obviously, in this area, there's tremendous amounts of rock. We invite you that when we finally open the winery back open to the public, please come and visit. We will show you some of our rock, because we have more rock than you've ever seen in your life. It's a hard thing to make a vineyard, but it's ultimately what makes the wines what they are today. So incredibly rocky site that overlooks the beauty of Lake Hennessy, but because it was also having this slope, which allowed kind of breezes to come through from the bay and then to the lake, and then had a different exposure, many people thought Cabernet Sauvignon almost couldn't get right. They called it, it was Anne and her husband, Joe Winder, they called it Anne and Joe's folly. Well, Allison and I are very happy that they were crazy enough to go on this folly, because we get to work with this land and these wines each and every day. You want to say a couple words? And then what I'm going to do is show everybody a handful of photos, because we all spend too much of our life on Zoom these days and just looking at each other. And we have a short little video, but also some photos to give you a sense of what this place looks like and maybe what it feels like, because ultimately that will help to translate an understanding of the wines.
Yeah, I was just going to ask Allison Tauziet if you would mind giving us just a little bit of your background, how you came to be here, and what your time at Colgin has been like, what you've seen.
Oh, that sounds great. Well, just a little background on how I got into wine. As a kid, my parents would come here to Napa Valley. My dad ended up living here after my parents divorced, so I kind of got exposed to food and wine, and went to UC Davis and took a winemaking class and thought it was exciting, and then worked my first harvest before the age of 21. And just thought this is something that could be, it's just so fun, could be so rewarding. And it just kind of one of those things where it when you're young and you don't know what you want to do, but you're enjoying yourself, it becomes a passion. And simultaneous to that, I had an infatuation for France, just since I was a child. And so after I graduated, which was with ultimately the degree in viticulture and enology, I went to Bordeaux. And so I really learned about wine more through Bordeaux than Napa Valley, despite the fact that I really began here. And so what was interesting was when I worked there, I worked at the CIVB, which is the Napa Valley vintners, if you will, of Bordeaux. And I worked for their wine school. And so I taught individuals that were visiting about wine. And it was really a process that sort of like when you teach, you really learn. When people ask you really good questions, you ask yourself really good questions. And that was just kind of how it unfolded. That after I returned from Bordeaux, that my next step was to work at Farniente. And I worked with that great Cabernet house for about 5 years, and then came to hear through the grapevine that there was a position at Colgin for an assistant winemaker, and met with Anne Colgin and Joe Wender, and really will never forget that experience of, well, of course, we had some really amazing wines that they wanted me to like pick apart and discuss and kind of get a feel for how we communicate about wine, and if that was a shared communication. And it really hit it off. So I began here in 2005, and my first work here was really in the vineyard, and really just particularly here in the United States. The vines were just 5 years old when I began, and to get to see such young vines, you know, in hindsight, really develop and establish themselves has been enormously, given me enormous perspective. It took me a few years to really see more than one side of how special this place is. And what I mean by that is, I think the very first vintage I worked with the wines, I could tell the complexity, I could tell the color, I could see what came so naturally to it. And then in me developed just a true love and appreciation and gratitude for the vines here. And, you know, after a few years, you sort of see some vintages that are easier. You see vintages, you work with vintages that are more challenging. And I remember in particular, it's the vintages that are the most challenging that kind of gnaw on you at night. And those were the challenges that I ultimately really realized that embracing them was the fun part.
Yeah.
And looking for what's so beautiful about them and bringing that out in the wines. So that's a little bit about my philosophy on how we make the wine here. That we want to always bring out the best in the wine, and that may sound very cliche, is the word, but really enhance the beauty in every vintage, in every component, and every block.
I remember a few years back visiting Maria Jose at Lopez de Heredia, and we tasted her 2002, which is famously a disaster of a vintage. And I said, you know, this is delicious. This is really good wine. And she looked at me and she said, you know, it's those vintages that aren't very good that we work the hardest on, that we're probably the proudest of, and that they may be actually our better wines because we had to think so hard about what we were doing. And so, you know, I do find myself sometimes drawn to those so-called difficult vintages as a taster. Like, you know, 2011 obviously is probably brings back memories for a lot of people in California and elsewhere. But let's talk about the 2010. You know, what are you, for both of you, how do you feel about the 2010?
Before we jump in, just so we can get a little bit of visual understanding.
Oh yeah, let's your video. Sorry.
Yeah. Let me just show you a few little slides.
Okay.
Because, you know, tasting wine, just looking at each other is fun, but oh wait, the host has disabled screen sharing. Can somebody turn that on for me?
Yeah, I bet Carrie can do that. Let's see.
Okay, well, wonders of the power of Zoom. Okay, there we go.
Coolio.
Okay, great. Okay, so we're just going to kind of go through these because we just wanted to give you kind of a sense of exactly what this looks like. Okay, so presently we're right about here. We're tasting. This gives you kind of a fall sense of what the vineyard looks like as the vines are turning. And you'll see the slope and how it's carved kind of basically from a forest. It's surrounded by a forest. And those become very important components in terms of how we describe the wine, because great wine is not just about fruit, it's also about the other. And we say that our philosophy is that we want to craft wines of perfume. You want to smell them as much as you want to drink them. Freshness, after you taste the first sip, you can't wait to have the second sip. And then also minerality. It actually tastes of a place. And I think quite often in the New World, and sometimes in Napa Valley, we just talk about fruit. We don't talk about kind of what it tastes like. And we have this beautiful place to work with. And this gives you a little bit sense of what it is. Okay, so this is just a quick little to give you some perspective. I'll turn that off, but it gives you a little sense of the dramatic nature of how this is. So some drone footage that we did that shows some rocks, kind of some alliteration in terms of how we feel, because this wine is always much more powerful and dense and savory. That gives you kind of this undulation of exactly what the vineyard looks like, feels like, and ultimately smells like. I mean, we even talk about that the sense of place is not just dirt, it's also the sense of kind of what the environment smells like as you go through it. So just a few other, and we will go through these relatively quick, but it's also the edges of these vineyards, the chaparral, become important in terms of our discussion. So now that you get a sense kind of where we are and what this place looks like, let's actually get to tasting some wines.
Yeah, absolutely. And a question arose from Kent, which was that, there are clearly great wines made on Pritchard. And so the question is how, are there specific ways in which Colgin's property is differentiated from some of its neighbors and nearby vineyards?
I think most people might not realize the dimensionality of Pritchard Hill. You have elevation, you have exposure, you also have some variation in soil types, but ultimately the higher you go, the more the more rock you have. So you have volcanic rock up to our highest point at 1,400 feet elevation. It's fractured volcanic rock. And what's so fascinating about it is that as the rock fractured over time and as rain penetrated it, those fractures, it weathers the exterior of the rocks. And that is what becomes the soil. It's essentially clay from the weathering of the volcanic rock. So the soil here is kind of this combination of very, very well draining with the rock and then water holding for the clay. And so the draining is important in springtime as it devigorates the vines during their growth. The water holding is important during fruit development as it retains moisture and provides resources for the vines, provides moisture. I think it would be great to delve into the 2010 because I'd really love to talk about some of the aromatics and the texture that make this this property so unique.
Yeah, please.
Actually, Doug, you're going to say something, or
Doug's drinking.
Okay.
I'm drinking the 2010, so we should probably talk about the 2010. So.
Yeah. So, honestly, the first aroma that always grabs me when I first taste the Nine Estate is the iron. It's the clay iron in the nose. The 2010, we chose that partly because this is already representing not just some of the primary beautiful fruit and mineral aromas to it, but it also really clearly expresses like secondary, even tertiary aromas that come from the site that are more subtle and nuanced. And for the Nine Estate, those are aromatics that are like rugged sage that grows around here. You have quite a bit of what we call, or in Rhone, they would call garrigue. So it's essentially just the wild weeds that are growing, and they're very aromatic. That also includes the bay trees that are growing here. That bay leaf has that really beautiful botanical note to it. So the botanical quality is always a signature that repeats itself year after year in the Nine Estate.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the garrigue thing, because I've long believed there is such a thing as garrigue in virtually any other place that grows wine in that are interesting wines. And I think there is a Napa or Napa garrigues, plural, depending upon where you are. And I think this wine definitely expresses it. One of the questions that arose while you were talking was, if there are differences that you can describe in the Nine Estate between the early years and currently. And of course, the follow-on question was, is that winemaking? Is that vine age? Is it climate change? Is it anything else? And of course, the answer is yes. But how do you view it as somebody who's actually having to grapple with it?
Well, I think honestly, in my first few years, something that imprinted on me quite a bit was when we had some heat spikes, we would see fruit dehydrating, and to work so hard and to have fruit dehydrate, it's first of all traumatizing, but second of all, it really impacts the overall signature of the wine. And so, from that moment forward, every decision that we have made has really been driven by how can we ensure that we are growing the vines to not only create fruit that has amazing flavor and phenolic material and color, but how can we make sure that we're preserving it when it's at its most vulnerable at the end of the season? How can we retain all the freshness? So really what's evolved is the approach to just make sure the fruit is shaded when possible, shaded, and we're using the leaves as much as possible to do the cooling. So I think I have a pretty big fixation on freshness. I really want to see the fruit come to our door without needing to be sorted. I want the fruit to be beautiful, and it will most naturally kind of extract in those situations. The 2010, if we want to dive into that vintage a little bit.
Yes, please.
So we're 10 years into the vine age at this point, which is a nice amount of evolution and rooting depth and little resilience already developed into the vines. This was a year that was possibly a little late in terms of bud break, but on a whole, it was actually slow to develop. I'd say, like, it was a slower, drawn out growing season. And one of the things I remember pretty vividly is at the beginning of August, there was kind of a cup to Jesus, like, okay, are we going to get there? we're moving along. Everything looks good, but when we look at the calendar, it's a little scary. And so it was like, well, do we do something or not do something? And so that was, many people had that conversation in early August of 2010. Which route do we go? And some chose to remove a lot of leaves, and in order to enhance development, maybe burning off of the pyrazines, and to instigate aeration. And we specifically, had to look ourselves in the mirror and say, okay, we did everything that we should have done by now. And if something happens, you don't want to do something irreversible. And we're glad we made that decision, because I think it was the 22nd of August, there was a very big heat spike, and it was right in the middle of aeration. And that is a really vulnerable moment for the fruit. And berries can burn if they're in the sun, right in the midst of switching from the green and developing a little pinking and then full color. So we held our course, and we had luck on our side. because we did get a really lovely long finish to the season. I think we picked the majority, and maybe 90% of our Cabernet between like October 15th and October 22nd. And it all came in and it was just fresh, so fresh. And as it's aged, it's been truly precious to see how it's retained so much of what we grew and what we made. We have some of the fresher, dark fruits to it. There's also definitely a telltale botanical note to it with the sage. And you know, the minerality that comes through for us is, everybody's got a different idea of what minerality might be, but in the 9 estate, it's that iron, and it can also be like a crushed rock. We know rock a lot, so we know what the smell of crushing rock smells like.
Sometimes 9 estate, particularly with a little bottle age, and I saw a question come up in terms of how tin is on its evolutionary curve, is with that iron, it gets a little bit of this sanguine note, where you do get a meaty tone, but it's a meaty tone, not like you get in Syrah, but it's like the perfectly aged meat. And then in this wine particularly, we're beginning to get those elements where it's like the cedar and kind of classic aged Cabernet, but classic aged Napa Valley Cabernet still surrounded by the very unique botanical herb and savory notes that are just emblematic of this area. It's also, just to circle back a little bit on the question that was asked about what makes this site different from the rest of Pritchard Hill. It's like Allison was saying, it's an incredibly diverse area. And I think too often people first say, oh, Napa is monochromatic, it's one thing. No, it is there's 52 different soil types in Napa Valley. Just on Pritchard Hill, there's 3. But even within this aspect that we have, we're still actually inside the fog. So a lot of our neighbors talk about above the fog. We still feel that there's a hillside origin to this. And why I say hillside is that quite often people say, oh, this is a mountain appellation. Generally, we say the mountain appellations are above the fog line. All of our vineyards are either in it or below it. And that becomes really important in these vintages where at the first part of 2010, there was lots of fog and it was cool. But then when this heat spike came, not only does it allow the fog to come in to help cool the vineyard down, it also, the fog naturally carries a little bit of moisture. So it actually helps more to preserve that freshness, that the vineyard doesn't race too far out ahead and start to get too much of the dehydration or the run up of alcohols or of too exotic flavors. And I think that's really what separates this 10, is that you get a vintage which had this long, cool growing season, the speed bump of heat to get it ripe, but still you see this natural acidity to it and the sheer length of it.
Yeah, for me, the 2010, I was delighted when you chose to include 2010 because it's a vintage that very much appeals to my sensibility. And yeah, there's no question, Allison, as you say, there were a lot of people who just went crazy stripping leaves and was like, people, for God's sakes. Often it was funny during, the run up to harvest, it seemed to me like it was only the old hands who went, hang on, we've seen this show before.
We always get a heat spike.
Yeah, exactly.
It's inevitable. It's inevitable. And yeah, don't do things that are irreversible, really. Right. And it's having faith. I think that's part of what my experience has also been is in a variety of different types of growing seasons, seeing the resilience of the vines and how the fruit behaves under different circumstances. There's still always so much character in the fruit as long as you don't do something to lose it. Having faith, like you said, is so critical. It probably takes a certain amount of maybe arrogance also, but it's confidence at the same time. I think it's proven. So
confidence born of experience and understanding. So other questions. There are, of course, a number of questions because a wine like this, that's what's so great about a 10-year wine like this is the questions really start popping out because there's so much going on in the wine. But one of the questions was, what about the terroir brings out that iron character? And it's a seemingly simple question, but it's actually a really quite a complex and difficult to answer question, but do you mind taking a stab at it, both of you?
I don't think it's been proven scientifically exactly how minerality really truly gets into wine, but I can certainly vouch for the fact that the fruit is not clean, meaning it's not dust-free, dirt-free when it arrives at the winery. So one can only imagine that some of the soil makes its way into the wine. And I really think that the iron and in the clay, it imparts nuances and it gets magnified through winemaking. And the same goes for the aromatic oils from the garrigue. They are in tiny, tiny amounts in the soil, but winemaking has a way of magnifying what is there in a beautiful way. And so they become subtlety in its youth, but they become complexity in its age. And so I think the 2010 is a really great magnifying glass on how the wine in this property express themselves.
I mean, you have to think that vines have been in the ground for the 2010 for a decade, but preceding that for 1 million, maybe 2 million years was forest and all this other stuff. So there's that decayed matter in that, whatever the mechanism is for uptake, and it is a very controversial subject in the wine world. Certain people believe it doesn't work, but I think you taste enough wine from around the world and you're like, wait, I've been in that vineyard and I walked that vineyard and seen the dirt on my shoe. And then all of a sudden there's a similar flavor. It's like when you go to Chablis, the same thing. Why does Chablis taste the way it does? And then you walk the vineyard and you're like, okay, I kind of get it now.
It's the old, who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes? You know, I mean, it's there in the flavor. Yeah. It's there in the aroma, and right. You can stand in the vineyard and smell these things. Why the hell wouldn't those, aromatic compounds land on grapes and end up in juice and end up in wine?
They did. I mean, I kick my boot in the dirt in the springtime. I smell that rich iron, wet note to the iron and the clay. And at the end of summer, I kick the same boot, in the soil, and I get a dryness and with a rock that sticks out more because it's, the clay's no longer wet and the rock kind of pops out. And it's just like I walk the vineyard and I smell the wine, and vice versa.
So a question arose here, and perhaps we should move on to the 2014 here in a second, but at least Terrence is with me on that one, that the 2011s are a vintage that people should not overlook. They're fascinating wines. They are of a different, sort of style, if you will. The vintage put its mark on them, and those that are successful are fascinating wines. They're really good wines. So me and Terrence, if nobody else, I'd like to speak up for the 2011s. But then Joe is asking, how many people actually get involved in blending trials, and how complex are blending trials for you all?
Can I add one thing about the 11 before we're talking about the blending? I earlier on was referring to how those challenging vintages are kind of the ones that, they solidify the mission, right?
Yeah.
And they enhance the passion. And 11 for me was one of those vintages clearly, and it really showed me another facet to all of the properties that we work with. And, despite the fact that I had, more sweat, more tears, more anxiety, I, going forward after that, kind of said to myself, I want a little bit of this in every year, in that the freshness was so appealing and so dynamic that that vintage will have its own age-worthy, it will have age-worthiness with a different dynamic based more on its acidity than its phenolics probably, but there's something unique in that I wanted to see going forward.
And on the 11, you made a point that in terms of the style, I don't know if the style is different, but it comes across as different because traditionally the wines have more fruit. So you start fruit and then the minerality is underneath. 11, it was almost the opposite, where they were in this equal component. And then people are like, oh, well, there's not enough fruit, therefore they're not what I would associate with Napa Valley. You're like, no, just give it time, because if it's already in balance, it's simply going to not be as maybe broad as other vintages that people traditionally think of as Napa Valley, but the primacy of the site came through. And we're seeing a number of questions come through 11 that it is a vintage, which I just think people didn't know what to think of it. And 10 for a lot of people tasted 10 right at the beginning, and they didn't know what to get of it either. And then the critics who really taste a lot of great wine were like, wait, these 10s are like where it's at. And now even critics are going back to 11s. They're saying, there's something there. Not every wine. I'm certainly not saying it's a homogeneous vintage in Napa Valley, because it was like your O2 in Spain. The great sites come through, the great properties come through, but they're actually, not only they have this fresh and almost crunchy fruit component, they really take that perfume up to the next level.
Wonderful. Actually, somebody's asking, can you, reference the 2011 Carriade, simply because Bruce is drinking it right now. We are jealous. Although 2014, so how jealous am I really? This is pure pleasure here. So
I think the 2011 Carriade, that's super exciting that you're drinking that. There's the Merlot in 2011 that was part of a really unique contribution to that blend. It was so fragrant and silky, and it was a great achievement in ripeness, and retaining a lot of purity. So yeah, the Carriade was I think stronger for its Merlot in that year. We don't typically say that.
Well, I think that was even an important part about what 11, one of the many lessons of 11. 11 taught a lot of people to look at Merlot differently. Not to look at, I need to get Merlot like Cabernet. I need to preserve all that beauty that is Merlot. And I think it began to change dynamics of how we all looked at it.
Yeah, I would say the front, that richness at the front of the palate of that 11 Carriade is driven more by the right bank varietals that we're able to get more ripe and tannin, less by what in a normal vintage would be driven by that kind of baby fat that the Cabernet might have in a normal year. So it was a different yin yang, but the puzzle pieces come together ideally, really, so they're complementary.
Yeah.
Move to the 14, Doug?
Yeah, please. So 2014, a question arose at are there average, obviously 2011 is a different thing, but when we're talking about 2010 versus 2014 versus 2017, as we're enjoying, are yields distinctly different in vintages like 2010 from 2014?
14 was certainly more clusters on the vine, and there was the need for a more rigid response to drop fruit, to be honest, in order to ensure consistency in quality and concentration. So we dropped quite a bit of fruit in 14. But I feel like those types of details, what we sort out or what we thin, that's kind of like stuff on the cutting room floor. It doesn't go into the publishing.
The B-roll.
It's the B-roll. So if we wanted to really dig in a little further on the 14, a concept that's really important for me. In the cooler years, we see perfume, we see aromatics, we retain them really well. In the warmer years, we have texture to be thankful for. And what's unique about 14 is kind of the go-between, because it was never hot, but it was warm. So we didn't have heat diminishing any flavor, yet at the same time, we had warmth to develop the ripeness of the skins, and seeds, which ultimately gave us a really lovely, silky texture. And the fruit in the wine of the 2014 vintage kind of has some darker fruit notes, if you get that. Plum, like licorice for me really sticks out, black licorice, but also like a brightness, blood orange. And then the texture, it's a little bit driven by a difference in acidity. So with the warmth, there was a little diminishment of acid, so it's a little lower in acidity, but the texture of the tannin, the ripeness of the tannin kind of pulls it through and gives it quite a lushness, brightness.
And forgive me if I'm misreading it, but is the alcohol actually lower in the 14 than in the 10? Did I read that correct?
I don't remember off the top of my
I mean, they're all relatively close.
They're pretty similar.
I mean, we don't see dramatic, like, oh, 1 year we're 13 and 16. No.
Right. Yeah. No.
Virtually,
It's just,
I mean, virtually every year, because that's also a nature of the site, but also the control that Allison and the team do in the vineyard to ensure uniformity of each cluster and berry. So it's always going to be 14.5 to about 15.2 almost every year. I'd say the 14 also is a vintage that, just like 10 started off with one dynamic, 14 did too, because remember that was our period of our big drought. So one of the unique things about 14 is also that even though we'd had basically hardly any rainfall, we almost went a full calendar year without rainfall, bud break started very early because basically the soil dried out, there was no moisture, boom, we get started, and then it gets warm, but doesn't get extreme warm and just held. Yeah. And then there was actually a lot of fruit. It kept growing fruit, drops some fruit, grows some fruit, drops fruit, grows some fruit. And then it still ended up being, up to that point, one of the, more bountiful vintages that we'd seen. And it always had the plushness and the texture. And then with bottle age, it's beginning to get more of that bouquet that you associate, which the 10 had at the very beginning. Yeah. So with age, you still definitely see the distinctness of the vintage. That's the beauty of wine. But you begin to also really see the inherent personality of what is underneath, i.e. number 9 estate, which I think is important because quite often people don't talk about that. They, we all spend a lot of time about, oh, this is what a certain site tastes like in Europe, but we don't always give as much credence to, I think, as we should in the United States on that, and especially Napa Valley. This flight was selected to show you different vintages in terms of climatic conditions, but ultimately you see the thread of what is its personality, its nature.
The one of the questions actually revolves around that, do the individual Colgin sites have specific Bordeaux analogs or are there models that you whether you consciously or unconsciously give consideration to that? Are there, lodestars for you, Allison?
I would say, okay, I would avoid really thinking of it that way in terms of like naming a producer. I think you could, after they've had some age on them, you could draw some parallels, which is, intellectually stimulating to do that. But I think it's more, in my mind, I am like really imprinted by the wines from Bordeaux, and it's their purity, it's their consistency, it's whether it's the purity from Pomerol or the classicism from Pauillac, like silkiness of Margaux. Those are all in my mind when I'm, that's inspiration that helps me have vision for the wines. But at the end of the day, they need to be made in a way that enhances where they came from, where that fruit came from. And so really to not project anything onto them, but instead look for what is so unique about them and grow it to enhance that, and then make it to enhance that, to really bring it out, make it more obvious. And those will be characteristics that will stay with it for decades.
Sure. Should we talk further about the 14, which is just in a fantastic place right now? As complex as the 2010 is, the 14 is as you've already alluded to, Paul, it's just this kind of open, easy to embrace. It's not intellectually challenging yet. It'll get there. Right now, it's just an emotional, teddy bear in its way. So, how do you feel about it?
Well, I think that you kind of said it. The 10 is sometimes more intellectual. You're thinking about the 10. The 14 right now is just like the pleasure principle.
Yeah.
Like man, this is good.
Keep
Like,
drinking.
right. I was like, great, I gotta drive home. I need to start drinking this wine because I know how good it is.
Yeah.
Because it shows what I think is the kind of the beauty of great Napa Valley hillside Cabernet, that texture, that kind of human catnip, I call it, where you keep taking a sip. But then particularly on the finish, notice the quality of tannins. There's a tremendous amount of tannin, but they're very fine, they're very graceful. And that's, I think, how the wine's going to age. It's going to come and have a different expression as tannin, because it should, but it's going to be much more of, I think, this, I won't go so far as to say decadent, but a wine where it's more this suave texture oriented that you're shooting for.
Absolutely.
And I mean, I think the lodestar question as to Bordeaux is, yes, we all do that because they have 1,000-year head start on us. But when I sometimes travel and now I see people and they're like, oh yeah, I just had the XYZ version of a great Bordeaux and it reminded me of Colgin. I was like, yeah, there you go. That's what we need to start talking about. We've only been doing it 28 years, but I promise that people will begin to understand that there's memories which bring you to make a linkage. It's what's great about wine, but ultimately they're so distinct that we're not trying not to talk about that. We even say internally, we don't make Bordeaux blends. Yes, that's what it is, but we make hillside Napa Valley Cabernet blends because they're distinct. We love Bordeaux. We drink Bordeaux. We know people in Bordeaux. We're partners with people who have Bordeaux properties, but it's so distinct. You need to look at them and celebrate the beauty in and of themselves.
So questions have arisen where 2010 is and where it's going to go next, sort of question, as well as where do you find 14 and what do you expect of it next, indeed, as well. So, how would you characterize those? And then we'll have to move on to the 2017 as criminal as it seems to flash past the 10 and the 14 so quickly.
I honestly think the 10 is kind of in this point where it's going to be in stasis for a while. I think it's expressing youthful aromatics and fruit, simultaneous to just a lot of earth and mineral. So I think it's hit a point where it's just going to hold really strongly. I mean, I think it's got 20 more years on it.
Oh, easy.
And I feel very, very confident in that.
I think what we sometimes see is that when the wines are released, they have the beautiful fruit that you associate with Colgin. Around their 7th birthday, they go through a transition where they begin to drop a little fruit and you start to see some of the minerality, the botanicals, the essence of what is underneath. And they hold in that period for 10 years or so. And then all of a sudden, something occurs where now the aromatics really get turned up. The texture stays the same, but aromatics even go to the next level. And then they hold there. And even when we go back and look at our original vintage, not just of number 9, but all the way back to 92, we're incredibly encouraged because we don't think any of these wines are going anywhere anytime. Will these wines age 50 years? Sure. I don't know if that's important anymore, but I have no doubt that any of these wines will make old bones because they start with all of those elements in perfect balance to have ageability. So I would say watch the 2010 because it's just going to get more of that savory mid palate, almost what today in the 2010 like umami. And then probably in about 10 years, then it's going to get super crazy aromatic, maybe almost like the 91s were in Napa Valley. 14, I think, will follow this element of texture because the acidity is not so high and it's more going to age on its phenolics and its texture. It's going to hold the texture for, I think, even longer. And then it may have to get to a point past where, because we're at that 7th birthday, but it's not showing that it's going in the transitory stage. I think the 14 will sit for probably another 3-4 years like this, where it has more of this decadent pleasure principle. Then begin to make that transition. Probably maybe more like the 94s.
Cool. And 2017, have you had a chance to pour the 17s?
Yes.
Cool. Yeah, this is the teddy bear principle is not exactly what's at work here, because if it is a teddy bear, it's about 15 foot tall, and I'm a little frightened. It's kind of like, what do you want? Why are you approaching me?
Yeah.
Wizard of Oz.
The Stay Puft Marshmallow Man.
Exactly. Yeah, indeed. What are your thoughts around the 17?
Well, the 2017 vintage gets a bad rap early on, I think, just like the lemon did. And I think it's typically because of the publicized fires that happened, also the heat. But in my mind, what really shaped the wines in terms of the growing season was really more the winter and the spring rains. Not a lot of people talk about that part of the season because the season got more dramatic as it unfolded. There was like about 200% rainfall, which on the surface sounds a little shocking, but what's so beautiful is in hindsight, that is what brought the balance to the heat that year. And so we had these really healthy, vibrant, lush leaves, canopies, shoots all the way to the top. Everything was just so perfectly set and suited to really survive some of the high heat spikes, which occurred mainly during the summertime, though there was the Labor Day heat spike that kind of got out of control. But what's important about what I said about the canopies and that healthiness of them is that as they were ripening or as they were setting the grapes, they created a lot more acidity. When you have more leaves, you have more acidity. So when you have the heat, your acidity is starting higher and going down. And during those heat events, 2017 started with an intense amount of acidity, and it survived everything. Not just because the balance from the healthy canopies, also because we took some creative efforts in the vineyard and we put shade cloth up. We have that as a backup to protect the fruit if we think we need to lower it and prevent any burn to any berries. And so that coaxed us through some of the most challenging events of 17. The result was berries that were really small, concentrated. What I noticed is that all that water in the soil, early on it went towards the leaves, but even in halfway through the season and during fruit set, it was going towards the leaves. It wasn't getting pumped into the berries because the leaves were cooling themselves like as a survival mechanism. So by harvest, we had really small, concentrated berries with very thick skins and a really lovely amount of intense acidity to them. So we arrive at harvest with quite a bit of flavor. And at that point, it's just a balancing act of extraction. When you have a smaller berry, you have a higher concentration of phenolics in a smaller amount of juice. So it's tasting very often just to ensure you're not, you're steering that race car smoothly and not gonna go off the track. So with a relatively quicker extraction, less extended maceration, everything we can to really highlight the intensity and the brightness in the wine, minimize really the tannin and the concentration of it.
Yeah,
So,
well, it's not lacking in tannin, but it's one of those things where I know that I suppose in some circles, or particularly outside of the wine industry, when we start putting adjectives on tannin, it sounds kind of silly, but these aren't those blocky tannins. These are more, somebody's polished these because the tannins are very present, but they have more of a polished character here than some 17s I've had for sure. And it makes the wine very attractive, despite the fact that it's a wine that seems to be asking me to salute when I, pass in front of it. So.
Well, it's also if you taste the 17, there's characteristics of both the 10 and the 14 and the 17. It's higher acidity, different quality of tannin, but then has texture and more power. It's more tightly wound. Yeah, 17, as Allison said, people only want to talk about what happened at the end. The real story is, I think, from about Verasion on to really help to decide kind of the style of the wine. And I think the 17s are going to age. It'll be interesting to see how they age, but I think that it's going to be a vintage which will probably behave a lot like maybe the 10, but with more mid-palate density.
Yeah, it's there. That's for sure. It's a serious wine, but it still retains its freshness, and it's that open, because I see freshness as that is sort of a way in, as opposed to the monolithic fruit and tannin blockiness that I think some people unfortunately think all Napa wines carry, which they don't. They can be
also, I mean, this wine has only been in the market for 2 months, so it's a baby. I mean, it's infanticide, but it's really good. So
I think something that's important to point out, though, on the palate in the 17 is that beyond the concentration of tannins that you're alluding to, is there's something salivating in the 17. So the minerality goes beyond, the aromatics of the iron and the, crushed rock into something that really is succulent and sort of, salivating is kind of the best word that comes to my mind. And that is umami is kind of a good way to, refer to it, but it's kind of it's juicy in its own way.
It's almost salty because it has this crushed rock element, which again, once you taste that, you want another sip, but that also shows that it is going to have this very long ageability curve.
Yeah, indeed. For me, these are 3 distinctly different wines with 3 distinctly different personalities. Nonetheless, they carry a thread that lets me know I'm enjoying one of the greatest vineyards in the world, and a vineyard that places its mark upon a wine in a very distinct way. It's really fun. I mean, for me, this is an utter treat. I don't get to do this very often. I have some 9 Estate on the restaurant wine list, and interestingly, there were a couple of questions that came up about Syrah, and I always find it sort of interesting that when I got my Colgin allocation, my Syrahs went out the door first. I was kind of like, see, But some people had asked about if STEM inclusion is part of the program with Syrah, and if you wouldn't mind making any comments about the Syrah program as well.
Oh, yeah. So honestly, what's so interesting about growing Syrah on the same site as growing Bordeaux varieties, when you have really great dirt, is you truly see like that great potential that Syrah can have. All of the texture, aromatic complexity, concentration that's in our Syrah is from the fruit. We don't need any skins. We dabbled in it, experimentally, but it became a stylist. It tasted stylistic in a way that was not true to who we are. And so the purity of just fermenting it in stainless tanks the way we do the rest of our wines was really the right thing for us. That being said, it needs to ferment in open top tanks because it has a really intense affinity to become reduced. So it requires more air constantly during the fermentation. So the open top is truly the best choice for that.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Well, I certainly don't want to close this off to questions yet. I know our time's quote unquote up, but I don't know anybody who wants this to end. Certainly, I still have wine. So do you want to prognosticate at all about what, if you're having to give consideration or feel challenged by what we all discuss and feel like, intellectually we need to be grappling with the thing known as climate change, that, how is it impacting your future thinking, if not your current thinking?
I can feel that as well.
Yeah, well, we're actively thinking of it, not only today, but we're even in the process of planting a little bit of new vineyard. So it's going into decisions as to here we are today, but where are we going to be in 10 years or 20 years? And if we follow this path, well, you hopefully only plant a vineyard once every 20 plus years. You have to make those decisions today, but it's something that is, we talk about a lot.
Yeah, on my mind a lot. So in developing a vineyard, it's been really, really important to look forward. What we know is that we don't necessarily think about it in terms of, warm, warm, warm. It's more volatile. The volatility of the weather is what's in our future. So we may have severe drought, we may have a lot of rain, we may have a lot of heat, we may have a cool. So kind of designing a vineyard that's a little more versatile. And in my mind, that water comes to mind. And so water resources. So planting a vineyard that is lower density vines, uses less water, and then gives it a bit more ability to add trellising that can create more shade and protect the fruit more. I'm sticking with Cabernet. I don't feel the need to experiment with, the varieties. I feel that year in, year out, despite these different growing seasons, Cabernet is so consistent qualitatively. It just has different facets to it always, and I think it's so dynamic. So I put all my chips on Cabernet, and Cabernet Franc and Petit Verdot in there too. But it's really how we grow it that I think is the ongoing, evolution. So continuing to think about how we use our resources wisely.
Sure. I do wonder sometimes it must be difficult to make decisions when you are, when you carry, forgive me for putting it this way, but a greater responsibility than, say, your average vineyard, than your average winery, because you have this legacy, because you have this reputation, because you carry the torch really for amongst the greatest, that Napa can offer. It's probably got to be sometimes intimidating or maybe even constricting to decide what to do next, because you have this gem. You don't want to break it up into pieces, and say, look, now we have many tiny diamonds. Isn't that nice? So sorry for the metaphor.
As long as it's diamonds.
Yes, exactly.
No, size matters.
I won't take that.
Okay, never mind. Do not quote me on that. I know that. Now I'm regretting this.
See, that's what Cabernet does to you.
It's true.
No, I mean, it's a very good point, because we're trying to make decisions that are generational decisions. We're not in a state that's like, oh, well, it didn't work, rip it out and start over. I mean, we'll do that if we have to, but it's, again, what are we doing today that's going to have an impact for the next generation? So we're doing it the right way at the beginning, which certain people think that we're kind of crazy how we do vineyard development. But when you see the end result of what you've just tasted, and then if you see what we're working on now, where it's dramatic, even for us that do it every day, and for people to visit, about how much we're putting into this decision at the beginning, to ensure that when you get a bottle of wine that's coming from that, it's every bit the sequel.
Yeah, I'm sure. Well, Allison Tauziet and Paul Roberts, thank you so much. It's very kind of you to spend time with us. I'm just grateful. Like I said, I don't get to drink this wine often enough, so it's pretty special and pretty wonderful when I do get to do so. So thank you for that. And I have a few friends who are in the hotel around the corner who are going to thank you even more, because they're like, "What are you gonna do with the wine?"
You'll be very popular. You're very popular in Walla Walla tonight. But
yeah, exactly.
Thank you, Doug, because it was also when Benchmark called me and they said, well, who would you like to be your moderator? It was kind of like the draft. And I was like, oh, I get a first round draft pick? I was like, all right, I'm going with Doug Frost. So thank you for being with us and leading the charge for us tonight.
Well, thank you. That's super kind. I'm just like, yeah, this is the way to do a Wednesday, if nothing else. But perhaps this is just an indication of how 2021 really is going to, take it's been taking its time, but it's going to get better, and it is going to get better, and just keep going in that direction. So, absolutely. Here's to that, and here's to you guys for making and bringing us fantastic wine. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you, Doug.
Thank you, Benchmark, Jen, everyone from the Benchmark team, Colangelo and Doug. Cheers. Okay, go be very popular in the streets of Walla Walla, Doug.
I will indeed.
Colgin shooters as you walk down the street.
Okay. Talk soon.
Bye. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.